Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. After taking some serious losses in last year's federal election, the new Democratic Party, the NDP, is trying to figure out what went wrong and how it can rebuild. Some former members of parliament who lost their seats last year are now leading a campaign of party renewal, an initiative to mobilize the party's grassroots, inspire activists, and make the party more democratic. So, what are the prospects for that renewal? And will the party's leadership listen to these calls? Joining me today to discuss all of this is Matthew Green, the former NDP Member of Parliament in Hamilton Centre, who was defeated in the 2025 election. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Desmond.
It's a pleasure. Matthew, you represented Hamilton Centre from 2019 to 2025. And so before we talk about this renewal, I just want to ask you, what has your life personally been like these last many months not being in the House of Commons anymore?
Well, I had a chance to regulate my nervous system a little bit. I'm out of fight or flight. I'm enjoying my family. I'm loving being back in community. You know, the job title might change, but the work stays the same. So we've just gone right back to what got us here in the first place, which is, you know, reaching out between neighbors, having critical discussions without the kind of false sense of urgency and importance that often surrounds the Ottawa bubble.
I'm glad to hear you're feeling a little more chill these days. That's very nice. But you're still working and still busy, obviously active within the NDP, a party that has undergone its own review of the last election campaign, as it does after every election. And that's separate from your now renewal initiative that you're doing. So I read a little bit about the NDP's review of last year's election. And in short, the party really seems to be saying that the setbacks of the 2025 election, where the party lost its official party status, were mainly outside of the NDP's control. You know, we have had this big conflict with the United States, obviously, with US President Donald Trump, tariffs, and it seems to be that the NDP says that that was the ballot question. People saw the Liberals as better positioned than the NDP to fight Trump, and so there wasn't really much that the NDP could do to kind of make its case better in the last election, to change its fortunes.
Well, I think it's undeniable that Donald Trump's attack on our sovereignty, the threats to not just impose tariffs as he has, but also potentially annex Canada, were a black swan event that we could not have prepared for. But I would also argue that the gradual decline of our party has happened over the last 10 or 15 years. And I think much of what faces the general public in terms of political estrangements, not feeling attached or connected to decision-making, is also reflective in our party. And so by over-centralizing decision-making, by over-centralizing control, and reducing the democratic distribution across membership, I think people just did not feel the connection to the party. Obviously, our communications were not resonating. We started the campaign off with this idea that it was going to be Jagmeet and some sort of cage match against Pierre Poilievre, when ultimately what it came down to was a scenario where we really needed to communicate to Canadians that our Westminster parliamentary system works better with multiple parties. We've been reduced to a two-party system, effectively. Most Canadians think that they're voting for a prime minister when they're not. And I think we fail to, A, connect with our base, B, expand that, and also C, communicate to people what was required in this moment to ensure that working class voices were still reflected in Ottawa. And in that failure, we're now left with two conservative parties, albeit one more progressive than the other. These are two conservative parties who are, you know, fighting this faux culture war, but ultimately getting the kinds of economic policies that Harper could have only dreamed of.
Now, you mentioned that we don't directly elect the prime minister of the country, and that's true. However, leadership obviously plays a huge role in how campaigns play out and how media coverage plays out, how people understand the parties. And you mentioned Jagmeet Singh. He took a lot of criticism, obviously, for a lot of the election losses that just happened. Do you think it's fair to attribute, at least in part, the kind of poor campaign showing of the last election to Jagmeet Singh, the former leader?
I don't personify the loss in Jagmeet. I think the strategy to put all of our concentration on the leadership rather than communicate the strength of the core members of the caucus, rather than, again, demonstrate that we can continue to be the conscience of the country. I don't think it was believable. I mean, it's not that I don't think. Canadians didn't think or believe that he was going to be prime minister. And so having Mark Carney instead of Pierre Poilievre could have happened still with 40 or 50 new Democrats. And there would have been a working class voice within the House of Commons. But by reducing our campaign messaging, our culture, to this kind of personification of the party in this charismatic leader was ultimately the wrong strategy to choose and hasn't been successful since Jack Layton. But even when Jack Layton was successful, I think a lot of New Democrats, particularly those that were around him at the time, forget that the Liberal Party was in a free fall. The Bloc Québécois was in the wilderness. So the preconditions for Jack's success were very different and in fact can never be replicated. We had union donations and book offs. There was all different types, per vote subsidies, all different types of things that allowed us to be competitive then that we don't have now. And so, I call it the James Carville bow tie New Democrat who believed that if we just had the right focus group, the right product as a leader, that we could somehow break through. And that's just not the case. And I think in a lot of ways, Jagmeet was our charismatic answer to Justin Trudeau. And we thought if we could just out-Trudeau the Liberals, we might be able to win. But what we come to find is that over the course of those 6 or 7 years of his leadership, that in this moment, what Canadians needed was a steady hand, somebody who they believed could be credible with the economy, and ultimately deferred to the authority of a central banker. And so it's not even the case, Desmond, that Bay Street got their guy. In this case, Wall Street got their guy. And now we have a CEO running the country exactly like a CEO would.
By the way, I think that this is probably the first ever James Carville reference on The Breach Show. Very well done. You mentioned the consolidation of power, the centralization of power inside of the party. And I want to talk more about where does power really lie in the NDP right now? Who gets to make the important decisions?
From my observation, there's a cadre of, party stalwarts who consider themselves the adults in the room. Again, a lot of these people would have had the halo effect from being around the Jack Layton campaign some 20 years ago. These are people that have gone on to be talking heads for the party. They're pundits. They're connected to GR firms.
GR?
Government relations firms. So their work is now in brokering power rather than winning it. And as an example, our former national director who became our principal secretary, to this day, I'm not sure what a principal secretary in that context does, but she's now working, in a GR firm alongside the campaign chair of Mark Carney. And so at the end, like that Ottawa bubble, that kind of champagne circuit that's out there often lends itself to a level of assumed expertise on what average Canadians want, and ultimately I think leads to what we've just experienced in the last 3 elections, a steady decline of the party by not taking bold positions and clearly differentiating ourselves from the Liberal Party.
And how does this play out, like, specifically? Because, you were on the inside. You saw how decisions were being made, I gather. So let's take something like, the supply and confidence agreement between the Liberals and the NDP, or the NDP's evolving stance on Palestine, or things like that. How does the party actually say, here's what our stance is going to be, here's what our policy positions are going to be, here's what we're going to go out and say to Canadians?
I would say on the vast majority of, the decisions that are made, there is, I would argue, more of a democratic process within our caucus than within other parties. That's relatively speaking. In other words, we defer to critics. Again, the internal workings of our party as the fourth party opposition meant by definition, we didn't have the resources to have a central policy bureau, a research bureau that would hand us from a high the talking points and directions of any given issue. I would often see in committees, liberals and conservatives get an email from somebody and their entire direction change kind of at the drop of a hat or the push of a button. We didn't have that. But on issues that were considered third rail, so you mentioned Palestine, pipelines, I would say in a lot of ways Quebec sovereignty and this idea of what multiculturalism looks like in Quebec, these third rail issues were absolutely predetermined by the leadership. And when I say the leadership, I mean the chief of staff, sometimes maybe the national director, but often the national director is at the direction of the chief of staff. And so for those that are listening that don't know what the chief of staff is, that would be the senior most person on the caucus side, so the caucus representing all the elected MPs. In theory, there's a caucus side and a party side, and the party side should be democratically elected as federal councillors that would then determine a national director. But in practice and in reality, the national director has been appointed directly by the leader. And so, again, I would argue, and as would many scholars who follow the NDP, that Jack Layton's brush with success and almost becoming the first NDP prime minister adopted this culture where the leader ruled supreme in many ways. And the federal council took on a culture of being a bit of a rubber stamp. And in that, you have unelected people who are not accountable necessarily to the membership or to their constituents, as we were as MPs, making critical decisions. I would be fair to them to say, and you referenced Palestine, that in my fight to pull the party closer to a moral and just position on Palestine, there was lots of spirited debate, but they never told me I had to take down tweets. They never told me I had to retract statements. And I was making statements on the question long before October 7th. And, we ultimately got to a place where, again, we moved an opposition day motion and spoke about the question of Palestine more in one day than any other party had in the history of the country. So again, the big issues were left to, quote unquote, the adults in the room. Who consulted with them? I don't know. I don't know who their focus groups were or their consultant references were. But what I do know is that sometimes it's the case in caucuses where the leader comes in with a decision that's already made, and caucus is simply something to allow people to sound their dissenting views, and then ultimately we walk out in unison on whatever the issue is. And by and large, we were a fairly cohesive caucus, but that doesn't mean we didn't have very spirited and sometimes tenuous debates inside caucus. I made the mistake coming from city council that caucus was like a democratic process and the majority would win. That is not the case in party politics nationally.
So you're giving us a very top-down, I would say, type of impression of decision-making. Is that fair to say?
Oh, it's absolutely top-down because, again, the whole idea of the party, one of the first questions I had when people kept referring to the party, they would refer to it almost in third person. I thought I was the party. I thought rank and file membership was the party. I come to find out the party was the central leadership, or at least that's, the interpretation that I took from the way in which decisions were made and the way in which the party was referenced. That the leader was the personification of the party. Therefore, the leader's traits, vibes, were marketed as a replacement for the values of the party. So in any given day, a statement of the leader is the de facto position of the party when, that comes with a complete lack of consultation with the grassroots and the membership and oftentimes, everyday Canadians.
I'm also interested in how people with different political viewpoints are able to kind of navigate the party. You, for example, Matthew, identify as a socialist within the NDP. And so I'm wondering from that perspective what it's been like fighting for a socialist agenda within a party that has tacked a lot closer to the political center than that.
Which party are you talking about? I would argue, like many people in my caucus, share democratic socialist ideals. But I think that there was this idea that Canadians were not ready for these bold alternatives. And these ideas were often set in a time and place that's past. The Red Scare of the 80s and 90s, I don't think works on our generation and younger. I think people understand general fairness, even if they haven't read Das Kapital. They know that this capitalist system is stacked up against them. They know that they don't have access to opportunities to be able to live this mythology of the Canadian dream, this maple wash version of, this liberal democracy that's supposed to mean work hard, get a good education, you'll get a good job and be able to afford to take care of yourselves and your families. That small L liberal lie has been absolutely exposed. And within our party, there was a lot of wait and see what happens when somebody like myself or others would come out with a bold idea. I'll use Leah Gazan for an example. She came out with a guaranteed basic livable income. It wasn't something that we necessarily hung our hat on as a party, but in doing a petition, I think she had over 60,000 people sign her petition.
And that's Leah Gazan, by the way, the MP for Winnipeg Centre, I believe it is.
That's correct. Yes. So a wildly popular idea, particularly coming out of COVID when people realized, people who might not have felt like they were in proximity to poverty came face to face with the reality that they were, in fact, 1 or 2 paychecks away from living in a very precarious and economically tenuous situation. That something like having that social safety net would matter for them. I think that there's a greater appetite for Crown corporate services, for protecting government as an institution that is supposed to distribute the public and common good rather than commodify it, rather than sell it off, rather than profit from it. I think those ideas are still core within our party. I just think that those consultant class, focus group driven people fail to have the courage to step up and actually offer that rather than wait and see. And so, Desmond, the analogy that I use in politics is that most politicians are thermometers, not thermostats. So they're checking the temperature. They're not setting the temperature. And I think that the NDP has a role to play where we could set that temperature, test big ideas, fight for a better alternative, a more compelling and caring alternative for the country, rather than tinking around the edges on boutique tax cuts for the rich.
Okay. Now, you and former MP Peter Julian publicly launched this renewal effort of yours in September. So first of all, just give us the broad sense of the goals of this renewal project.
So I think we recognized that the party has kind of operated in these cycles over the last 60 plus years. The last time we were in this place was in 1993 when there was a complete collapse. And at that time, Peter was working for the party. He took on the project of an NDP renewal process that was arm's length from leadership, that was more than simply a campaign postmortem, that really looked closely at the institutional shortcomings of the party, but also looked ahead and was future thinking about what a better alternative is. And I think the reason why I still believe in this project, even though it's not perfect as an institution, it's the closest approximation to my politics. I believe it's worth saving. I believe that it is an essential and core element to our democracy. And so when we're redoing this, we're doing it with an eye that recognizes with humility, because we've all eaten humble pie, where we're at right now. It does take time in understanding the failures so that we don't duplicate them again in the future. We've watched 3 very similar campaigns roll out without, I feel, really fundamentally learning from the previous campaigns. And so what this does is it goes coast to coast to coast. It engages with people. It talks about not just the what, as in policy, but the why. What does it mean to be a New Democrat? If you were to ask Canadians that, they wouldn't know. They would reference the characteristics, vibes, aesthetics of the leader, but I don't think that there's a clear and coherent universal understanding of what it means to be a New Democrat. And then how? I believe in watching the kind of demise of democracy writ large across the country. Canadians feel politically estranged, disconnected from decision making. They don't feel like they're actually a part of these systems, but to engage in them every 4 years. And if you hear that, you would know that's the same analysis I have on my party. And I don't think it's unique. And so we have to learn from that, and we have to provide a value in being a New Democrat, a input to things that people care about, to be able to go and engage with their neighbors, street to street, door to door, neighborhood to neighborhood, and then organize around that issue, and then use a party as a vehicle for the political expression of their material conditions. That's not the case right now. And so again, the renewal process didn't presuppose any outcomes. It listened to people, it reflected on the feedback, and it's going to offer a suite of resolutions like it did in 1994 to help close the gap on the democratic deficit within our party, re-engage the grassroots, distribute decision-making, to have real democratic weight around our federal council, and to create a difference, a firewall, maybe not a firewall, but to create a governance separation between the leadership's team and the democratic body that is the federal council.
Well, we know that parties are institutions. They have a leadership, as you've talked about, and they have a history and sometimes are very resistant to change. How do you evaluate your chances for success with this renewal campaign?
It's a simple process, but it's not easy. I never mistake simplicity for ease. Going out and getting votes in Hamilton Center, right, was a simple process. 2 years in a row, or 2 elections in a row. That third election was more complicated. But we are doing the work to engage with EDAs, to engage with organized labor, to have constructive conversations around what democracy looks like. And the truth of the matter is, in this diminished state, there's no better time than to rebuild the party. There's going to be less people likely at convention. The people who are going to be making that trip to Winnipeg are all going to care very deeply about the party, even if we have slightly different visions of what the future looks like. We see that playing out in the leadership race. There's 5 different visions of what the party should look like. But I don't rest my future as a New Democrat in one person or even one convention. So the mission that we have is to go out and engage people, to have renewal at the EDA level, the electoral district associations, formerly called riding associations, to strengthen that relationship with labor. There's this ongoing narrative that we somehow abandoned the working class. And yet when you ask people, who is the working class? They're very sheepish about defining that. And when you ask them in what ways we've abandoned the working class, they don't necessarily want to get into that. The threats that we have to losing our relevance and status as a party, organized labor also has. That as a diminished state, as a political expression of the labor movement is also diminished. And so we need to just come to grips with that, and we need to begin the work of not making this transactional, or what I call third partying the party, as though it's something other than what it was, which is the creation of the CLC and the CCF.
You mentioned the leadership, the ongoing NDP leadership race that's happening in the 5 candidates. This is a campaign, your renewal campaign, that has chosen not to endorse or otherwise get itself involved with any of the leadership candidates. Is that correct?
That is, yeah. It's not part of my theory of change. I don't believe a charismatic leader is coming to save us. I don't believe treating a leader as a product that we can shop around the country is going to materially change our outcome. What I do believe is that this is going to be longer than an election cycle. This requires strategic planning that goes beyond the next election and perhaps, the next several years. this is going to be a long and drawn out process. And what we need out of a leader, whoever is leading, is a commitment to respecting the democratic will of the membership. What we need is a federal council that is a true governing body that is representative of the rank and file membership. What we need are EDAs that are focused on creating community. We need them to be more than ATMs. We need them to be more than a donor a list building process. We need the people to feel like having value in the party looks like their values being reflected in decisions and the politics that are being positioned by the party.
Now, I understand not wanting to kind of exalt a leader and feed into that idea that a charismatic leader is coming to save the party. But at the same time, the next leader has to be invested, as you are and as this campaign is, in some sort of renewal before that can actually happen. And sometimes I think it's fair to say that a leader can also, as you've kind of demonstrated, can kind of push those processes to the side and decide to go their own way. So do you worry about that? Do you worry that you're doing all of this work here on renewal and that the leader might come in and have a different design, essentially?
I think what we're organizing to is a standard and not a whim of an individual. And so I think if we're doing this work right, we will raise the standard and expectation of New Democrats across the country that will simply demand this. And if we do this well, and if we're honest and ethical in the way in which we engage the membership, the executive function of the federal council, and whoever's elected, I don't think they're going to have a choice. If we go to convention and we elect people who are committed ethically to making the right decisions for the party and not the personification of the party, then we will have the governance structure on the national side to deliver that kind of deliberative democracy to the membership.
I'm so glad you mentioned the convention, actually, because that's where I actually want to end this discussion. The NDP convention is coming up at the end of March. The Breach is going to be there covering. And, I understand that conventions can be a really challenging venue for making desired political changes. So for people who aren't involved, Matthew, in political parties, can you tell us what the vibe of a convention is like? What the kind of prospects are for using that big gathering of the party to push through important changes that need to happen?
I think right off the top, if I'm being honest, I think it's an exclusionary process right out the gate. We're going to have this convention in Winnipeg. It's going to cost people over $1,000 to attend. Those that are chosen as delegates are people who have the means, the time off to be able to travel and do that. And as a policy and governance decision-making body, I happen to think the way that we run convention is overly orchestrated theater. And it doesn't have to be that way. There are democratic renewal tools that are out there. One of the tools in which I've used as an MP, one of the tools that we tested at convention was a tool called Polis. Polis allows people to digitally engage at home and talk about issues that they care about and add their amendments to it, to the discussion, and ultimately come out with better policy choices. I would love to see a place in which politics happens more frequently than every 2 years, that we're constantly seeking out and gathering and compiling feedback from our party members as a reflection of our base across the country, and then adjusting our politics accordingly. The guesswork of focus groups and polling simply does not work. How do I know this, Desmond? Because we're in the situation that we're in. So if we're going to continue to use the same tactics under the guise of the same strategy, we will continue to lose. And so we have no choice but to respect the will of the membership. And I think the hard work that we're doing in this lead up to this convention is to try to rally as many people as we possibly can Our intention is to have a showing that would be reflective of the excitement that people are talking about when we are on these calls. I think that there does have to be a openness to making policy decisions, deciding on policy in different ways, but not just that when the convention's done, having a commitment that the platform that is the expression of the democratic will, the membership, becomes the electoral platform that we take to Canadians. Because it's also been the case historically that we go to all these efforts to go to a convention, to fight for that one thing we care about. It's the number one priority. But then come election time, there's a focus group that's done, there's polling that's done, there's a decision made that that's not important for the vast majority of Canadians. And the thing that you cared about is now all of a sudden not on the table. That's a letdown to people, and we have to have congruence in being who we say we are. And I think when we do that and we define it, that it doesn't matter who the leader is. We need to commit to a base and foundational common ground as New Democrats, whether you're Democratic Socialists, whether you're a social democrat or a self-proclaimed progressive. And we need to stick to that so that no matter who comes or goes, there's a consistency that Canadians can count on as an alternative to the status quo, to conservative choices.
Well, this is a very ambitious project, and it's quite refreshing to hear you come here and speak to us about it today, Matthew. So thank you very, very much for your time.
I appreciate you having me on, Desmond, and I look forward to the convention and whatever the outcomes are of this leadership race in these weeks and months to come.
Yeah, we'll see you in Winnipeg.
You most certainly will.
If you like what you've heard on The Breach Show, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you'd like to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us create more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.